I'd like to move the amendment in my own name, Amendment 14, or when I get a chance, which is calling for urgent action on a report on this incredible injustice which was done to a huge cohort of our citizens in the budget of 2012, with the changes in the bands from from 4 to 6. And of course it followed on. I think it was based primarily on financial grounds. I think if you look at the documentation behind it at the time, projected savings, inverted commas, were put at something like 45 million over a number of years. It followed on, of course, the kind of cuts, unfortunately, that had been made by the Fianna Fáil government from 2008, and the changes they made in relation to the, the qualification period, or the qualification number of social insurance contributions, the doubling effectively of 250 to 520. So it was part of that grotesque attack, I think, on some of our most vulnerable citizens, and it penalised. I raised the issue with the Taoiseach way back, I think, in February this year, with Taoiseach Kenny, and I was saying basically it was penalising the women of his own generation, people who had been born in the late 1940s and all the way up through the 60s, and who had to take a period of time out of the workforce, rearing their children when we had very little kind of creche infrastructure or support for working mothers. And then when they returned, they find this devastating situation, and like the last speaker, I mean, week in, week out, women who were coming up to 66, they come to you and say they're astonished to find that their pension, having worked for a considerable period of their life, is so much lower than they were expecting it. A very fine briefing, as the Minister knows, report was done on this by Age Action at the turn of the year, in which the researcher, I think Dr. Maureen Bassett, she set out very clearly the huge impacts the cuts had on people, particularly on the lower bands, the lower levels of contributions, and particularly those in the from 10 upwards to 20 average contributions, where those with 20 to 29 ended up with just 85% of the maximum. The 15 to 19 ended up receiving 10% lower than pre-2012 and are down to 66% of the maximum. And then the bottom band of 10 to 15 average contributions also receiving the 10% reduction, and now just receiving just 40% of the maximum amount. And the clear, huge injustice of this, I think, was best expressed in this House by Professor Alan Barrett of the Economic and Social Research Institute, when he said that, and it's a very interesting point, he said that the government changed the rules of the game in the middle of the game, where there was a system that women were working and thought that they were working towards a particular pension, and then arbitrarily in 2012 this government came forward, and of course their PR spin was that no cuts in social welfare rates, but the reality was that Minister Noonan was impacting very savagely on a whole generation of particularly women workers, because I think 66% of the workers who are affected are women, and those 40,000 plus and growing cohort feel very angry. And I mean, I've heard many of these senior of our retiring fellow citizens, saying that this deserves a serious legal challenge based on the exact point that Professor Barrett made, and that it cannot be allowed to endure. And I know at the social welfare bill, and before in questions that I've asked Deputy Doherty and her predecessor, the current Taoiseach, there's talk about obviously working towards the situation in 2021 and having in fact some kind of restoration. But on the figures that the Minister gave me, there doesn't seem to be any serious approach to doing that, and we seem to be left with a situation where effectively the suffering of these women workers and some men, that will go on being a gross injustice. So I think the time has come, Cathaoirleach, that the Minister should absolutely come forward with a plan to restore. My own simpler approach would be that I feel the status quo ante in this regard for these workers should be restored. The losses should be restored. We heard a fairly positive report today from IFAC at the Budgetary Oversight Committee and the budget surpluses that we'll have, hopefully, barring Brexit disaster in the next couple of years, that one of the purposes for which, Minister, those surpluses should be used would be to do justice to this cohort of women workers who rear their families, who work so hard. I mean, we're all sympathetic to it, I think, but you have the power. You have the power to change it and to bring it back. It was a reprehensible decision in 2012, and I think, as I said, the Bassett report shows quite clearly that people knew that this was going to have a very disproportionate impact on women workers, and yet, unfortunately, a woman social protection, social welfare minister let that go through Budget 2012 and inflicted that, as I said, suffering on those women since then. And I noticed the Bassett report. It quotes the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, which was adopted in 1979 by the United Nations and which we ratified and signed in 1995, and which we gave a commitment through the homemakers and through the then regime for women's pensions that we wouldn't unilaterally, we would try and uphold that convention. And I know the Bassett report also refers to the European Convention on Human Rights on Article 14, and explicitly prohibits discrimination on how all the other convention rights should be enjoyed, and which includes the equal enjoyment of all the rights of the ECHR, that certainly includes pension rights for women workers. So I'd urge you, Minister, to accept all these amendments, and for Minister Doherty to come forward and to give us justice.
Thank you.